So wood being a natural product takes on and expels moisture depending on the season. So in the wet season, it's going to get bigger. Dry season, it's going to get smaller. And you have to plan for that when you're talking about installing it. Now, this problem gets exacerbated by the fact that we're now using much younger trees. So when a log ages a year, it gets a grain ring. No water can really get into a grain ring. That's what gives wood its strength. This log cut on the left shows an old growth pine tree, 500 years old. There's not a lot of water going to come and go in that board. But what they're milling today is a second growth, sustainable forestry product. It's a fast growth pine. This board on the right is going to experience a lot of size change, okay? And especially with pine when it's used indoors. A lot of people don't realize that. If you take pine from the outside and put it inside an air-conditioned environment, it's going to experience a tremendous degree of shrinking because air conditioning pulls the humidity out of the air and the wood will shrink right on the wall. And you got to know about this for pine paneling, especially if you're going to put it in an air-conditioned environment. You have to leave it in that environment with the air conditioning on for at least a week to 10 days so it can stop size changing. I've seen that hurt people before. When we see size change, we see a lot of it in the lateral movements, okay? That's why you see tongue and groove milled into like V grooves or with a little indentation on the end of the pattern so that when it shrinks and expands, the eye doesn't catch it as much. Now, when you mill a flush joint tongue and groove, which is what you're seeing a picture of here, and it shrinks in the summertime, it creates a little bit of a gap. The other concern with with the younger growth trees is the lengthwise shrinking and expanding. That's going to affect your install. Typically on the sides we have laps and tongues and grooves, so there's a little room for movement, but in the tips of your boards there's not. It's going to size change. An eighth of an inch is usually the most we'll see as far as the length of the board. This picture that you're looking at here gapped more than an eighth of an inch. Again, look at these grain rings. Now, it experienced size change longitudinally, but you can see this board on the right is really young. There's only 4 rings on a 6-inch board. That's a hugely young tree. And it's going to experience more size change, especially when it gets dry. This particular house was a redwood house, younger trees. That wall had been pounded on the south side by the sun for, the whole summer. And when that person put 2 coats of stain, it all swelled back up and looked beautiful and he was happy. So he's going to see some gapping in the summertime in that south wall. He's just going to have to stain it more often. Okay, to illustrate this next point, I've prepared a really highly technical demonstration. So I want you to pay very close attention so you don't miss anything, okay? When we make a miter cut on a board to seam it, so we're going to put it together on a run, we usually make a 22-degree miter cut. Here's my super technical demonstration. So we like a 22-degree miter cut. So when the board, this is the thickness of the board. This will make sense in my next picture, I promise. So with a miter cut, you don't want to install it right here because if you do, when it expands, it can ramp up. You like to install it an eighth of an inch back so that when it swells up, it's here. And the reason you do that is it's much more likely to expand than shrink. Typically when wood goes up on a wall, it's going to experience a little more expansion. You want to plan for expansion more than contraction because expansion causes more problems. End of technical demonstration. Take a look at this picture. This is the ramp, what it looks like on a wall. This is an up close of one ramp done wrong. And when you do it on a whole wall, it really screws it up. So rule of thumb is leave it back an eighth of an inch and you're safe and fine. It looks an eighth of an inch typically on a miter cut is not super noticeable to the naked eye. That's why you do a miter cut. If you do a straight cut, when it shrinks, it shows a gap like the one above. But if you do a miter cut, when it shrinks, it shows the back of the board. So the shadow's not as bad. It's not as jarring to the naked eye. All right, because the trees are getting younger and experiencing size changes of a greater degree, we like to stick with the 3/8 of an inch tongue. I like my tongue on my tongue and groove to be at least 3/8 of an inch. Because in this picture below, if you use a 1/4 inch tongue, and those are in the books, by the way, they have tongue and groove that just has a 1/4 inch tongue. I have seen it with the younger trees that it shrinks so much the tongue literally pops out. It just pops out of the groove. And when that happens, it messes up the whole thing. You get water behind. It's not something you want to have happen at all. And it happens because the sizes are getting smaller and the trees are getting younger and they change sizes to a greater degree. So the point of this is I like to see a 3/8 of an inch tongue to account for expansion and contraction. Even with tongue and groove, you have to account for expansion after it's installed. So we still like to leave our tongues off a little bit, 1/8 of an inch-ish, when we tap them in. And the reason is if you put it all the way, tongue fits all the way snug into the groove, and then it expands, it can break off one of those pieces. Whereas if it's got a little room, it'll expand right into that place, okay? As a rule of thumb, you always try to leave your insiding installation back 1/8 of an inch as best you can. You can use penny gaps. There's a lot of different tricks to do it, but you want to do that. In conclusion of this video, there's some common sense at stake. Obviously, if you're typically you won't install going into a dry season, but let's say you saw a forecast and it's going to get drier as you go. The wood itself is going to experience its greatest degree of size change when it goes from producer to its final destination. So that's where acclimating it to its environment becomes hugely important. On the outside, you stacklimate it, watch stacklimation video if you don't know what I'm talking about. And then you make sure it has adjusted to the environment. And then you install it on the wall, because if you do that, it's not going to experience a lot of size change after it's installed, and it's completely manageable. So rule of thumb is back it off 1/8 of an inch and plan for expansion and contraction. Thank you.